think we're ready to start. So welcome everybody. Thank you for spending your evening or afternoon with us wherever you are. My name is Francesca, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a grad global impact intern at the International House at U Chicago. The mission of International House is to enable students and scholars from around the world to live and learn together in a diverse community that builds lifelong qualities of leadership, respect, and friendship. Founded in 1932 by John D. Rockefeller Jr., International House of Chicago is today one of 20 members of the International House's worldwide network. In addition to supporting the graduate student community through our Graduate Commons program, International House also serves the greater Chicago community as a cultural and intellectual center for a wide array of programs. Close to 100 public programs are held each year at International House through the Global Voices Performing Arts and Lecture Series. And as we begin the autumn quarter, we'll be providing virtual, in-person, and hybrid programming. You can learn more about the different types of events at ihouse.uchicago.edu. The Global Voices Performing Arts and Lecture Series includes outreach programs with Chicago area international organizations, collaborations with foreign consulates, music and cultural performances, and discussions and debates led by distinguished guest speakers, including those for today's program that we are so pleased to co-sponsor with Seminary Co-op Bookstores. Racist and anti-immigration policies, from the border wall to the Muslim ban, have left many Americans wondering, how did we get here? In a sweeping account, Reece Jones reveals that although the US is often mythologized as a nation of immigrants, it has a long history of immigration restrictions that are rooted in the racist fear of the quote-unquote great replacement of whites with non-white immigrants. Connecting past to present, Jones uncovers the link between the Chinese exclusion laws of the 1880s, the Keep American nativism of the 1920s, and the quote-unquote build the wall chants initiated by former President Trump in 2016. Through gripping stories and in-depth analysis, Jones exposes the lasting impacts of white supremacist ideas on the United States law. Reece Jones is a 2021 Guggenheim Fellow and a professor and the chair of the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Hawaii. He has researched immigration for over 20 years and is the author of Border Walls and Violent Borders, over 24 journal articles, and 4 edited books. He is also editor-in-chief of the journal Geopolitics and lives in Honolulu with his family. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by John Washington, who writes about immigration and border politics, as well as criminal justice and literature. His first book, The Dispossessed, A Story of Asylum at the US-Mexico Border and Beyond, was published in 2020 by Verso Books. Washington is also a translator, having co-translated most recently The Hollywood Kid by Oscar Martinez and Juan Martinez, and Blood Barrios by Albert Arce, which won a Penn Translates Award. Following the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions, so please submit those via the Q&A function here on the Zoom. And please don't forget, you can purchase white borders from Seminary Co-op Bookstores. Now, please help me in welcoming Reece Jones and John Washington.
Thanks so much, Francesca. Great to be in conversation with you, Reece. You did a lot of my job, Francesca, is laying out this book. So I feel like we're starting in a really good spot. What I'd like to do is just do a little bit of framing of this conversation and then just jump into some questions. And Reece and I are going to kind of go back and forth about this really terrific book, which I'll hold up here for y'all, White Borders. So if you look at Reece's work, at his titles, a couple of which Francesca just mentioned, you have Border Walls, Violent Borders, a recent anthology called Open Borders, and now White Borders. You very well might think that his work was pretty siloed into borders. And in some regards, that is consistently very much the focus. But I think that would be misunderstanding two different things. And one is that the nature of borders and the nature of modern bordering really both overlaps and gets at so many other issues. I mean, you can look at race as is evident in the title of Reece's most recent book, gender, class, economy, geopolitics, every level of geopolitics, climate crises, etc. And so Borders really is revealing of all of those issues. And second, I think along the same lines, if you read and spend time with Reece's work, and you start getting through his very original analyses of a lot of these issues, as well as his uncovered histories, which this book does a just impeccable job at laying out, you'll see that I think rather Reece uses the border, uses immigration politics to illuminate politics in general. And I think even more than that, almost like human nature. And so that's one of the most excellent things about getting deep into Reece's work. So I come to Reece's scholarship from a very specific place. As a journalist, I've very happily been able to lean on Reece for some quotes to encapsulate a certain political moment, or use some of this context from his books to understand a new policy move. Reece is an academic, but what is really striking about White Borders, about Violent Borders, and all of his other books is how incredibly accessible it is. Not every academic has the narrative chops to really capture a character on a page, or to hook a reader in with a dramatic shift, or a sweeping description of a long historical period, even a lovely turn of phrase. These really illuminating sort of capsule biographies. And yet that's what Reece's work does. It's incredibly accessible, and it's in some ways almost like page turning at times, which is special. And I say that not just to heap praise on Reece, but there's something here that I think is really important to remember, and it was worth just thinking about for another moment, is that the accessibility is crucial because these are urgent matters. This isn't it could be written in such a way that it's this arcane academic style that is almost illegible to the vast majority of the world, but it's not. It really drives home the emergency that the world is dealing with, and the world is trying to deal with it through bordering, and that's causing greater harms. And that is something special, I think, that Reece both humanizes the issues and the people that he discusses, and really makes you understand the consequences. So I could just sing his praises for a while, but I want to do one more sort of framing introductory little spiel quickly, and then just get into some questions. So this is just the context of where we are immediately. And I think it's important to recall this in almost any conversation on these issues. Right now, there are just shy of 100 million people who are forcibly displaced, 100 million people forcibly displaced around the globe. They are refugees or asylum seekers. There are 1/3 billion, 300-some million international migrants. So those are some big picture numbers. Some smaller picture numbers. There's over 20,000 people currently detained in just awful, squalid immigration detention centers throughout the United States. I'm currently in Arizona. I know right now that there's hundreds or thousands of people who are, as we're sitting here, hiding in the desert because they're trying to migrate to find opportunity or safety. I know that people are being deported to Mexico, to other places, to Libya, to incredibly dangerous places where they are thrown into the hands of corrupt and brutal security forces or criminal networks. And this is the reality, and this is the absolute urgency of this situation. And I'm just so thankful that Reece brings this huge wealth of historical context to this moment. So, all of those things are sort of what drive me very often to write about it, or to feel like I need to uncover some current issue. And Reece and I have talked about this, and he sort of addresses it in the book, but I wonder if that's a good spot to start, Reece. If you could, one, sort of explain what brought you to this specific issue of White Borders, and maybe just kind of do some sort of summarizing of what your project was in this new offering.
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks, Francesca, for the introduction, and thanks to the Seminary Co-op and the people at the International House for inviting us. I'm really excited to be here and tell you about White Borders. Thanks also, John, for such a kind introduction to the book. Really, you can just keep talking, I think. If you're going to keep talking about it like that, I'm happy to just turn this over to you. But seriously, I started writing this book in the context of my previous book, Violent Borders, which you mentioned here, and gets into the issue of migrant deaths and why there's so many people, why borders have become so violent over the past few decades in a global context. So that book came out in October of 2016, so a month before Donald Trump was elected president. And so I watched his campaign and his election with that book in my mind. And a lot of those topics that I've been talking about in that book suddenly were being turned into these red meat issues for his base in very racialized terms. And so in that book, I talk about borders as being a mechanism for protecting privileges. And I talk about cultural privileges and identity, but the book is a lot about economics as well. And so I decided I needed to go back and really think about the relationship between race and immigration. I knew there were Chinese exclusion laws, but I'd always seen those represented as kind of an aberration, as if it was something that, yeah, it happened, but that wasn't really, signifying the entire sweep of American immigration laws. But what I found when I went back and looked at all of these laws and looked at the language around them as they're being put in place, they really, the language we see today, framing immigrants as a threat, talking about an invasion, talking about diseases, talking about drugs, talking about taking American jobs, talking about immigrants replacing white Americans. That's the same sort of language that characterizes all of the immigration laws that have been passed in the US.
Yeah, you mentioned like protecting privileges. That seems to be a one side of the coin, but is the other side of the coin oppressing the minority, or maybe those are, I think those are the same coin, just both sides. One thing that really struck me, this is a lot of the history that I've read around in the past in my own work, but it's nice to have it kind of see the through line here. And you miss a lot when you read around like that until you see a comprehensive take on it. And the thing that really jumped out at me was that citizenship law prohibited anyone but a free white person in the United States from obtaining citizenship until 1952. Is that right? And can you talk a little bit about how that law came about and how possibly it lasted so long?
Yeah, I was also shocked when I realized that phrase had remained in naturalization and citizenship law in the US until 1952, when it was finally removed. It was first put in 1790 in the first naturalization law, which says that you can be a free white person and have resided in the US for 2 years to become a citizen of the US. In the 1870s or 1860s up to 1870, freed slaves were added to that definition, so people of African nativity, but free white person remained in the rules all the way until 1952. So it's really not until the civil rights movement that we start to see a questioning of these categories that had been the foundations of who could belong in the United States, and a rethinking of that relationship between race and citizenship and immigration. So a lot of the immigration laws that I talk about in the book are very much in the context of that citizenship, right? That the US is really founded as a white country. It's a place for free white people to become citizens. And it's not until the first groups of non-white immigrants start to show up that the US starts to be very aggressive in implementing immigration laws about who can actually enter the United States.
Yeah, so I guess it's sort of like a two-part question here. One is, but did it stay on the books as an overlooked aberration? That sounds like a little naive to ask, but I just wonder if you know about who was keeping that there and wanting, to limit the who could naturalize until the middle of last century. And then, a related question, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about another really shocking fact that came out in your book was the exact timing of the creation of the US Border Patrol. That I don't have it in front of me right now, but I can't remember, it was a few days after I think the implementation of the clearly racist quota law of it came in 1924.
Yep.
And I was like, are things always that transparent if you actually just read through the laws and find out what is actually on the books and we're just not aware of it, or
Yeah, those are two big questions. So the Border Patrol, the first federal agents to patrol US borders for people crossing without authorization were actually set up in 1904, and they were called mounted Chinese inspectors. So they literally rode around border towns looking for people with Chinese appearance and checking their documents to see if they were allowed to be in the US. And then by 1924, when the US passed the national origins quotas, it's often called the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which put in these really strict limits on who could enter to the US. All Asian immigration was banned, and immigration from even Southern and Eastern Europe was severely restricted. And the idea was to switch immigration primarily to people from Northern Europe. And yes, the Border Patrol was established 2 days after that was signed into law. So the Border Patrol was literally established to be a racial immigration force, to enforce these eugenics-derived rules about who could enter the United States in 1924.
Yeah. So, I guess we've been talking, you mentioned the 1790 law, which was the Naturalization Act. There's a big gap between that and 1924. Another really important century in terms of immigration law, or in terms of immigration policy, took place over those intervening 130 some years. But it wasn't at a national level mostly. I'm curious, what was on the books? What were border policies and immigration policies in that century, and how did those fit into this racist paradigm?
Yeah, I think this is another thing that a lot of people don't know about or have misconceptions about. I think there's a perception that the United States has always had immigration laws, had rules about who could enter the country, but that's just simply not the case. The Constitution actually bans any limits on immigration until 1808. That was primarily about keeping slavery and allowing slaves to be continued to be brought into the country, but it says you can't have any limits on who enters the country until 1808. After 1808, a few states started to implement their own restrictions about who could enter those states. Primarily Massachusetts and New York had limits for the poor. So these they would have inspectors at the ships coming from Europe and ensure that absolutely destitute people would be turned back and sent back to Europe. But those tended to only turn back less than 1% of the people who arrived. So they weren't large-scale bans on who could enter the US. In the 1820s, Southern states started to implement bans on free Blacks entering their territory. The fear being that free Blacks could incite rebellion, right? That were already starting to happen, right? In Haiti, of course, and the idea was the people who were inspired by those movements would try to do something similar in the South. And so Southern states put limits like that. All of these state scale limits, though, were ruled unconstitutional. In 1849, there was a set of cases called the passenger cases, which said that only the federal government could regulate interstate constitution and immigration issues, interstate commerce, I'm sorry. And that was reiterated in 1875 in 2 different cases. So the reality is that there were no federal immigration rules in the United States until 1875. And as I argue in the book, it's not by chance that that's the time that these federal laws start to come into place. They're very tied to 2 separate things that were happening at that time. The first is the aftermath of slavery and the idea of Black citizenship. And then the second is the arrival of the Chinese.
Yeah, one thing, that is so surprising. And I think it is overlooked a lot, that absence of national immigration law in that long period. One of the original gripes of the early colonialists against King George, as written in the Declaration of Independence, was that he was going to limit immigration to the United States. And so that, there was a call for more migration, for what you may be able to call open borders, very early on in our nation's founding. So it seems like there's just been a pattern of paradox throughout immigration law, where some folks are wanted in and some folks are not. Or even like if you read through the history of various forms of Chinese exclusion and points of welcome, is that there's a swaying sort of back and forth that happens. And is that driven mostly, do you think, by just burgeoning or potentially dipping racist attitudes? Or, I mean, it's hard to make sense of it. If you just read through the timeline, it doesn't seem to follow any logical sense. So what's your reading about where this comes from?
Yeah. So in the book, in White Borders, I make the argument that it's certainly tied to race. And I think it connects to the free white person citizenship idea that we were talking about before. So it's the moment after the Civil War where slaves are freed, and by 1870, they get citizenship in the United States. And the white community at that time has this kind of reckoning with this new situation that was not what was, I think, intended at the start. And we see, I think, three different reactions to that. And all three of them are negative, right? The first is the reimposition of a hierarchy in US society through things like Jim Crow laws, through segregation, through violence like the KKK, that reinstates that white order, in fact, even if on paper people are given citizenship. I think the second thing you see in the aftermath of Black citizenship is efforts to remove African Americans from the United States. This is something that had started even during the era of slavery, with a group called the American Colonization Society, which was organized to move freed slaves back to Africa. The country of Liberia is set up for that purpose. Another of those facts that was amazing to me as I was researching that is that the American Colonization Society didn't actually disband until 1964. And even in the 1930s, Southern senators introduced acts into the Senate, for example, the Greater Liberia Act, which, if it had been passed, would have sought to remove all African Americans from the United States within 20 years. So there was this consistent effort to deport non-white people. The third reaction was the realization that they did not want to create a new race problem, as they called it at the time. In the book, one of the characters that I introduce is James Blaine, he's probably the most famous person of the 1870s and 1880s who never quite became president. He was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He was a senator from Maine. He was the Secretary of State twice in the 1880s and 1890s. And he ran for president 2 different times. In 1884, he was the Republican nominee for president, and Grover Cleveland just barely beat him in the election. The popular vote was tied, but Cleveland narrowly won the 4 swing states, and so won in the Electoral College. But James Blaine was kind of the earliest Republican senator who spoke out against the Chinese arrival. And he gives this speech on the Senate floor about how if the history of race relations in the country is any lesson, then the last thing the US wants to do is to create new relations with foreign peoples. And so for him, the easier solution is to stop the immigration. And so we see this rash of Chinese exclusion laws with that. The first one is the 1885 Page Act, which attempts to stop Chinese laborers from coming, but it does stop Chinese women from being able to immigrate to the US. And then in 1882 is the big one, which is the Chinese Exclusion Act that effectively bans all Chinese from entering the United States.
Yeah, the American colonization, that it was an actual group until the 60s, early 60s, it sounds crazy. Like that would be anathema today in popular culture. And yet, like, really, what is the difference between a group that publicly pushes a policy like that and massive levels of deportations? Or remember Mitt Romney's idea of self-deportations, or SB 1070, the 2010 Arizona law, that their policy goal was attrition through enforcement, making life so miserable here that people would leave. A lot of these things seem at first blush antiquated. Maybe the language they use is different, but this isn't a historical problem. I mean, can you talk about ways that this manifests today? And I mean, is racism guiding our immigration laws and policies of, say, the Biden administration, or at least 21st century immigration policy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the short answer is yes, right? I mean, if you look at something like Title 42, which is a health regulation, but it's used to remove people from the United States without even considering asylum claims at the border. And if you look at how it's been used, it's towards people like the group of over 10,000 Haitian people who arrived, right? Black immigrants arriving, asking for asylum, but not even having that asylum considered, and instead immediately deported out of the country. Really, I think I appreciate you asking me about this question, but maybe you are actually the expert on this topic, right? I mean, in your book, The Dispossessed, is all about this kind of asylum practices. And, in the book, you tell the story of a man, I'm not sure I can pronounce his name, but you could tell us some about that. But I wanted to maybe throw that question back at you and have you talk a little bit about what you think about the racialized asylum practices now.
Yeah, a lot to address there. And I feel like just looking at the recent treatment of the Haitians, a lot of people were rightly just aghast and disgusted about the treatment that was captured on camera. But it's not surprising at all. And it's not surprising that that was leveled at specifically the Haitians. I mean, Haitian migrants have borne the brunt of some of the worst and most brutal immigration policies over the past 50 years. To rattle off a couple quick reminders about what that looked like is the creation of Guantanamo Bay as first an immigration detention center was after a ship of Haitians in I think it was, it's been a little while since I looked at it, late 70s, maybe 77, arrived to Guantanamo Bay, a naval station, not a detention center at that point, asking for help. And instead of helping them, they were detained. And that set precedent for, throughout the 80s and 90s, detaining mostly Haitians, but also Cuban refugees. And then after 2001, it became, a absolute dumping ground and black site for so-called enemy combatants. Why Haitians then? Why that mistreatment of Haitians then? I mean, they are, like, Haiti has stood as a pivotal place in this hemisphere for a long time. You mentioned fear over something like the revolutionary spirit spreading to enslave Black people in the United States, and that took place in Haiti. The number of times that the U.S. Went and took over and invaded Haiti in the 20th century is hard to keep track of, hard to remember how many times. One other thing worth mentioning, and this is, I'm just kind of putting a couple data points in here, is one of the first enacted immigration policy changes after September 11th, the attacks of September 11th, was to deny parole to all Haitian asylum seekers, most of whom were held in Crome Detention Center in Florida. Haitians obviously had zero to do with the attacks of the Twin Towers or elsewhere, but that was the immediate sort of place that the United States government went. It was like their punching bag to work out their angst or their anger or whatever. And that has been something that's happened for a long time. You know, there's so much to talk about there. You know, one thing I'd like to pull it back to you, and then we could talk about immigration in general, or I think this also ties very much into asylum and refugee policies. Is, you know, the United States is the self-professed world leader of many things. They too lead the world, at least in part by example, in their the way that they enforce immigration and border policies, refugee asylum policies. Do other countries have such overtly, even if it's not always recognized, racist immigration policies?
Yes, I think you can say the answer is yes to that. You know, a country like Japan, for example, denies 99% of asylum requests each year, granting just a handful per year. Europe as well is engaging in a widespread hardening of the edges of the European Union to prevent the migration of people. That looks like border walls going up. It looks like patrols in the Mediterranean, forcing people to take ever more dangerous routes, resulting in tens of thousands of migrant deaths, which is what I look at in my previous book, Violent Borders. It also looks like pushing people back across the border. So when people arrive at a border in Greece or Poland, getting pushed back across and not even allowed to hear their asylum claims. So I think it is a widespread phenomenon. Australia as well. I think you can make some similar arguments. And they have the offshore detention facilities as well. I think just in the last few weeks, Australia signed an indefinite agreement with Nauru to hold immigrants who are detained offshore there. So it is a global phenomenon.
Yeah, those pushbacks is like the technical term for them, is when folks are trying to arrive to a place and ask for refuge or, you know, some sort of legal status, and they're pushed back beforehand. That came also from a policy implemented specifically against the Haitians in the late 80s and early 1990s. And there's a Supreme Court case that basically gave the okay, the thumbs up to continue to do that. And that was the model that Australia then followed, and as well as other countries. So yeah, I wonder.
I think, just one last thought on that. I mean, I think we really are right now witnessing the end of the era of refugee and asylum rules that had been in place for 50 years, where although it was inadequate in terms of addressing the refugee situation, there at least was a system for resettling refugees and for dealing with at least some fraction of the people that are displaced by violence in their homes. But we see that being completely eroded now, right? I mean, the US this year, despite Biden becoming the president and having 6 months to do something about it, let in the lowest number of refugees ever since we've had the Refugee Act. So I think we're at a moment where that system is falling out and something else is going to replace it. And right now it looks like that system is just going to be violence and walls and pushing people out and not having a way to address this fundamental need of people on the move.
Right. I mean, so the U.S. Refugee Act was signed in 1980. We followed some sort of like slapdash system before that, after World War II. But at least since then, until recently, it seemed like administrations felt somewhat beholden to the rule of law in terms of immigration, refugee policies. And since the Trump administration and in, you know, this so far in the Biden administration, it seems like all that's just out the window. It doesn't seem to be anything really holding them back from implementing policies that are clearly violations of their own laws as well as international laws.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, still, according to US law, it is legal to request asylum, and you have to set foot in the United States to do that. So, you know, but you're right. There have been so many different ways that that's been eroded and challenged. And sadly, the Biden administration hasn't undone a lot of that. But there's no doubt that the Trump administration spent a lot of time implementing those rules. And that's one of the things I talk about at the end of White Borders is to kind of think about after 1965, when immigration law was changed and the racial rules were removed, how this kind of racialized immigration policies reemerged into the political sphere in the US. And I tell that through the story of John Tanton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, which brings me to another question I have. You unearthed so many characters in this book, and like I said in the beginning, you do so with great panache, I think, and really tell their stories well and succinctly. Tanton gets some good treatment. Some other figures people may be aware of, obviously Stephen Miller, Jeff Sessions, but also some people that I certainly didn't know. You mentioned Blaine before. There's a number of other senators who are for or against different types of immigration throughout history. And I wonder, just like, it seems obvious we need to understand, what's driving Stephen Miller and how did he achieve the level of power to affect immigration law that is still being implemented today. But what do you see as the importance of really getting into some of that deeper history and some of those less well-known and much longer dead folks? Sorry, not longer dead. I didn't say that right.
Yeah. I think one thing is, when I was working on this, I found these people so fascinating, and the ways that they were talking and the things that they were doing were just so intriguing to me. One of the earlier ones is Dennis Kearney, who is an immigrant from Ireland and lives in San Francisco. And in the 1870s, he's one of the kind of firebrand speakers about limiting the Chinese arrivals. And he goes on a tour in 1878 across the Eastern US giving these speeches, and the press can't get enough of it, right? So, but if you look at what he does in these speeches, it's really a Trump rally. Right, he begins the rallies by criticizing the press and getting the crowd to boo the press in the back. There's even a fight in one of the rallies where someone beats up someone from the media. Then he talks about the problems of capitalism and how that affects the working man. And then he ends all of his speeches by demonizing the Chinese, right? And he ends every single one by saying, and no matter what, the Chinese must go, right? And then walks off the stage as the crowd goes wild in their rabid nativism. So it was really, the reason I wanted to tell some of these stories from the past is to see these parallels with the present, right? To talk about how, although it felt like in a way that Donald Trump came out of nowhere and Stephen Miller seemed to have merged out of nothing to suddenly be this hugely influential person in his early 30s. The reality is they were doing these things based on a whole series of things in the background that had laid the foundation for what they were doing in the present. So the language they were using has these echoes in the past. And then we mentioned John Tanton, but I think you can't understand Stephen Miller without knowing who John Tanton is, because Stephen Miller's whole anti-immigrant philosophy is built on this network of organizations that John Tanton built starting in the 1970s.
Yeah. The McClatchkeys too, if I'm pronouncing that right. I just like recognize the name because the news service, but just didn't know anything about those brothers and their own virulent, if racist immigration policies that they espoused. You mentioned, just briefly, I just kind of want to say his name, but you mentioned the character that I profiled in my book. The man I profiled in my book is Arnovis, who's a man from El Salvador, and he struggled to get into the United States to find safety a couple of times with his daughter. And one of the things that he told me, we spent a lot of time together, and I got to know him pretty well. One of the things he told me is that when he crossed the border into the United States, he said, I could feel it. I was less than human. I was less human. And that, that's something that sticks with me. And I think about that a lot when I read almost anything in the news about immigration. And it feels like that is something that a lot of people are dealing with in the United States when they come into confrontation with the law as well. And I wonder, like we have, I think in the past few years with the rise of Black Lives Matter and some like really good critical scholarship of policing, we've learned, I feel like as a society really, not everyone certainly, a lot of people are pushing back on this, but we've learned to understand the mechanics, even the existence of policing through a racialized lens. And we've also understand the consequences, and we understand that people are dehumanized or murdered. And it seems like the way that we still talk about immigration policies and immigration policing, deaths are termed as such. They're not termed killings, really. And the understanding of why we enforce the borders or why we enforce immigration law is a sort of a strange knot of different ideas, but we don't see it, I think, largely through a racialized lens. We should. I mean, I think we should. It seems very much like you think we should, but why not? Why haven't we got there? Why haven't we hit that critical moment yet?
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly one of the goals of this book, is to make the case that immigration policy is fundamentally about racial exclusion, that it was the first immigration laws were about racial reasons, right? About stopping non-white people from coming in the US. Immigration police were set up to do that, to prevent people with brown skin from entering the country. And they are allowed to use racial profiling in carrying out that. And then the results of it are racialized, right? The impact of these rules creates the population of the US as it is, right? So it very clearly needs to be seen through a racial lens. And I think it's probably most clear if you look at the ways that white supremacists talk about the issue. For some reason, we often when we think about white supremacists in the US, we often see them through the lens of white-Black relations, right? And we think that the majority of what groups like the KKK are talking about is that relationship, right? About Black people in the US. But if you actually look at what they do and what they say, they talk about immigration as much or more than they talk about race relations in the country. And they see immigration as more of a threat to their ideals of white supremacy. And that's evident in the long past, in the lead up to the 1924 Immigration Act. The second KKK that starts right before that is all about immigration as the biggest threat, right? Their slogan is 100% Americanism, right? To keep America American, as Calvin Coolidge said in that election campaign. In the 1970s, David Duke, who was the grand dragon of the KKK, he would go to the border to carry out a Klan border watch, right? So saying that the US wasn't patrolling its borders and that the Klan was going to be there to do it for the US, right? In some ways, presaging the ways that Republican politicians today all make their pilgrimages to the border to talk about these issues around the border. So that's something that the KKK was doing 40 years ago, right? So immigration has been this fundamental issue for white supremacists for a long time. And I think that that's the lens to understand why you have to understand our immigration restrictions in racialized terms. In terms of why we don't, I think that we are often taught in schools that kind of one of the normal things that states have is a border. And has immigration laws, and it just seems it's kind of the racial aspect of it is removed, and it's presented as if it's just normal, right? It's just normal to have armed police at the border deporting people, and it's just normal to have to show a passport when you enter a country, but it's not. One last anecdote. I know it's probably getting close to time for questions, but in 1882, when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by Congress, the president at the time, Chester Arthur, actually vetoed the first version of it. And he did so. One of his complaints was that it required a passport for people from China to enter the United States. And he thought that to be way too onerous. So he vetoed it because it had a passport requirement, and instead sent it back, and they changed it to a certificate for people to enter the United States. The US didn't require all people to have a passport to enter the country until World War II. So, and in Europe, passports really only become a widespread thing after World War I. So a lot of these things that are taken for granted ideas about the way that immigration should work and the way that borders work are not that old, right? And what the case that I want to make in this book is that we need to think about them as a tool of white supremacy.
So I think that leads into one other question I have for you, and then we'll take some questions. But, what do we do? I mean, I think besides questioning it and reframing it, very good, important steps. But I wonder if there's something either more concrete or I know that's a hard question to answer. But I wonder too, like, without trying to ask you to prognosticate, from like, as you write in Violent Borders, like the borders are proliferating. Like the number of borders throughout the globe are far higher than they were 40 years ago. Like with the normalization of bordering, like, is there any hope? And with going back to my framing in the introduction, with the obvious and incoming increase, huge increase in the number of forcibly displaced people, are we just going to see more people run up against border walls and shot down by border guards or detained and deported? Or is there a way out of this like really dire near future? And if so, what? How do we do it?
Yeah, I think the near future is a little bit dire. I think if I'm predicting for the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be more. I think more violence, more walls, more border police, and more people on the move, right? And so it's going to be a lot more detention camps, and it's going to be, I think, not a pretty situation for the next 5 to 10 years. But I would push back though with the other point that even though in the public sphere we often talk about immigration in these policing terms, and the voices, the anti-immigrant voices, are very loud, right, and get a lot of media attention, and for whatever reason the media tends to use their framings often, right, of crisis, of threat, of danger, of out of control and things like that. But if you look at other things, like the Pew has done a poll for almost 20 years about Americans' perceptions of immigrants, and that has swung heavily towards being pro-immigrant. In 2001, I think 53% of people said that they thought immigration to the US should be decreased. And only 10% thought it should be increased. In the latest version of that poll, the number who think it's increased is in the 30 percentiles, and decreased is down to 20%, right? So there's been a fundamental shift in the public's opinion as a whole towards a more positive view of immigration, but that isn't reflected in the policies that we see happening. The scholar Wendy Brown wrote a book about border walls over a decade ago, and she's changed her view a little bit on it, but I think there's some value to what she says. She says that the walls that we see in the violence at borders is really the signs of the older system of the state as the fundamental political unit, kind of in the last throes of trying to reimpose its control, and that building a wall and putting a bunch of guards there to shoot at people because they're not obeying your laws, it shows that they don't have a lot of respect for those laws, right? And she sees it as as the last parts of this state system as we're transitioning into a new world and a new system of organization. And it's going to be messy and it's going to be violent, but it also suggests that maybe in the longer term, maybe 50 years from now, the world will look a lot different than it does today, and that we might not have the same sort of state sovereignty that we have in the present moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a really interesting book, and yeah, a good point, and maybe even a sliver of hope to end on as we go to some questions. I guess I will just read them out. The first question is from Christopher Chavez. Is this right, Francesca?
That's okay. You can read them if you want it, Mr. That's totally fine. That's what I'm here for, but you're good. You already
Okay,
got it.
okay. No,
You already
please,
got
please.
it.
Okay, I'll do it. I'll do it. All right, I'm from Douglas, from Christopher. Douglas, Arizona, not too far from me right now. It seems that many of the ranchers in that area are always ready to talk in terms of, quote, crisis on the border, even if there is none. How can the media critically question these disingenuous accounts by those on the border that want a, quote, permanent crisis to justify racism, anti-Hispanic sentiment in Arizona, since they were in Arizona before the whites, quote, whites came into the 19th century?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of touched a little bit on that just a second ago, to say that well, I would back up and say, I've hinted towards John Tanton several times in this, and I think it's again here to mention his name. The whole second half of the book is kind of tracing the impacts that John Tanton had, and what he did in a snapshot was to start a bunch of groups in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that would pursue an anti-immigrant position in American politics, because he found in the 1970s no one was really doing that. And so his goal was to kind of reinvigorate the anti-immigrant position in the American political spectrum. And so he created all these groups so that they can quote each other, they can talk to each other, and it can seem like there's this broad grassroots movement against immigrants. And most specifically, they're designed to give quotes to the media, right? To provide a study that shows a negative impact of immigration, to have someone there who works for a group that's called something like the Center for Immigration Studies to say immigration is really bad and there's a crisis at the border. And so those groups have been really good at shaping the way that the media talks about these things. And additionally, the media likes crisis, right? If things are boring and quiet, they don't want to report on that, right? They need something that's going to be a story to tell. Not you, John. You're the good media, right? We're talking about the other media, right? But it's true, right? I mean, all quiet on the U.S.-Mexico border just isn't a headline, right? So crisis at the border is a headline. So I think all of those things combine to have the border reported in a way that just isn't accurate of what's actually happening there. You all who live in Arizona know this better than I do, but I mean, I visit the border frequently. I walk along the border all the time. The border is not in crisis, right? It is a quiet place. It's a sleepy place. Most Border Patrol agents have relatively little to do. I've just written another book about the Border Patrol, which will come out next year in July. And one thing I calculated was how many apprehensions the average Border Patrol agent made from 2010 to 2020. And it worked out to one apprehension every 11 days on duty, right? So imagine that, right? They're out there for 8-hour shifts, work days, and for 10 days in a row, 80 hours, they find no one, right, on average. And then on that 11th day, they apprehend one person, right? So the other way to think about that, it's like 2 apprehensions a month for the average Border Patrol agent, right? So there is no crisis at the border, right? Even the numbers we've seen over the last year of higher number of apprehensions, it's still nowhere near the level of apprehensions in the year 2000 or the average in the 1970s or 80s, when the Border Patrol had only a fraction as many agents as they do now. So it's as the questioner, I'm sorry, I forgot his name, Christopher is suggesting, it is a manufactured crisis, right? That serves the Border Patrol to get more funding for them. It serves right-wing politicians who can go down there and give speeches and kind of rile up their base about this danger. And it certainly serves the border security industry, who has profited enormously from the expansion of infrastructure for enforcement at the border.
Yeah, or I agree with all that, Reece. And it also just calls into question, who gets to claim crisis? I mean, so Border Patrol agents or Border Patrol spokesmen or Border Patrol union leaders claim crisis. And so do mostly right-wing politicians get to claim crisis. And so do some people who have their fences cut on the border, the ranchers claim crisis. And yet, what is the crisis for the Haitians who were deported back to Haiti after yet another earthquake, after the assassination of the president by U.S. trained Colombian mercenaries? Or what is the crisis for people in immigration detention centers, wherever they are? those to me, I mean, if you think about the word crisis, this is like a culminating event that could lead to death or, some form of misery. I mean, absolutely, these people are living in crisis. But that is not the crisis that makes the headlines typically. Yeah, I mean, you think like this goes, to another point, like people claim often that, there is chaos on the border, or there would be chaos if more people came across the border. In many ways, the chaos is in the, immigration system that is just so incredibly disorganized, that it's incredibly backlogged. They can't keep their paperwork straight. And, the chaos really is so often on the other side. I think chaos and crisis are both just completely misunderstood in terms of immigration.
Yeah, I think that's right. The fact that we have the people trying to cross the border without the proper documents, that's because we don't have a system that is functioning to allow people to get the proper documents to come to the United States, right? I mean, we can look back to something like the Bracero program, which had all kinds of flaws in it, but it was at least a guest worker program where people could come to work in the United States. When that ended in 1964, and then Mexican immigration to the United States was capped in 1965 and went into force in 1968. The things that we see happening in the border are fundamentally about that, right? It's the product of the laws that create these categories and the lack of a legal way for people to come to the US that produces the things that we see at the border today.
Yeah.
Thank you both for that insightful and thought-provoking conversation about racism in conversation and in discourse with the border. We do have one last question, and I don't know if maybe we would like to finish up with that because it talks about hope. So let me read it to both of you right now. It's from Hannah Schut, a question on hope. With racism being woven into the very fundament of policies on immigration, citizenship, and with it, the politics of quote unquote belonging, is there a possibility for reform, or is it a radical rethinking and redoing of these policies necessary?
Yeah, I think radical rethinking and redoing is the answer to that. I mean, John mentioned the kind of sweep of the books that I've written, and I think that's the thing that comes across in many of them, is making the case that we need to rethink our relationship with movement. Something that people have done for thousands of years is move from one place to another. It's a fundamental characteristic of what humans are, is to move. And so the idea that we can restrict that groups of people can draw an imaginary line on a map and then say no one else can cross that line, and if you do, I'm going to use violence against you. To me, that's the radical thing. That's the thing that we need to question and call out as fundamentally wrong. And the idea of people just wanting to move from one place to another for opportunity, for family, for work, that is a normal thing. And we need to imagine a future world where that is upheld, and the violence towards people who make that movements is the thing that is deplored.
I'll let you leave it there, Reece. Very well put. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. I would like to end with one last note, and that is you really should buy this book. You should buy it because it's good, and because you'll learn something from it, and because it's really essential to support folks who are doing this kind of work. I get that is self-serving because I'm doing something along the lines too, but support the bookstore, support Reece and his scholarship, and give it as gifts, and read it and think and contemplate on all the wisdom that's inside of it. Thanks.
In line with that, don't forget that you can purchase white borders at the Seminary Co-op Bookstores, Seminary Co-op Bookstores. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Mr. Jones and Mr. Washington, for joining us tonight, and for everybody who was here. Have a good evening, and we'll see you in the next version of our Global Voices program. Have a good evening.
Thanks, y'all.